Good morning. My name is John Mayle. I'm the Ecosystem Division Manager for Martin County. Here with me is Jim Gordon, who is the Deputy Director for Public Works. We also have several other team members for this LOSOM effort in the room. Kathy Fitzpatrick, if you'd raise your hand, she's our Coastal Division Manager. Ruth Holmes is our representative from Martin County's attorney. And see Katie Bowes, who also works in the Ecosystem Division, and Ann Murray, who is in our Utilities group and supports our efforts on this task. So this morning we are going to provide a brief description of what the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual Planning Project is, and a summary of the county's activities as they relate to this project. I'm going to do my best to avoid using acronyms, which this process is full of. As we all know, that the Lake Okeechobee is the heart of the Everglades system. It supplies the natural system with water that is the lifeblood for the River of Grass. With the construction of the vast water management system throughout Central and South Florida, Lake Okeechobee is also the keystone in the flood protection and water supply system. Regulation of Lake Okeechobee is an integral part of the restoration effort ongoing in Central and South Florida, working with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan to better manage the hydrology of the regional system and meet the many faceted needs of the urban and natural environments. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina precipitated a review by the Corps of Engineers of all of their managed dams, which found the Herbert Hoover Dike to be substantially compromised and at high risk. That precipitated a planning project that created our most recent regulation schedule for the lake, which was affectionately called LORS 08. LORS 08 was intended to provide a more safe management level for Lake Okeechobee until the repairs that were prescribed by that process to the Herbert Hoover Dike were complete. We're now coming up on that, and in 2008, Congress approved in the Water Resources Development Act a planning project to replace LORS 08 with a new management plan for Lake Okeechobee. That process is required to follow the National Environmental Policy Act, which helps to capture and qualify environmental impacts to these construction and planning projects. Go to the next slide. These regulation schedules tend to be fairly complex, and we can err on oversimplifying. This chart shows the various lake management bands as well as the historical water levels on the lake dating back to 2008 when LORS became the water management plan for Lake Okeechobee. As you can see, the dark black lines indicate different bands that constitute a decision-making Gantt chart that also feeds into several other factors, including the tributary hydrologic conditions, the short-term weather forecast, a 30-day forecast, seasonal outlook, and then multi-seasonal outlook. And then that prescribes a band of decision-making flexibility for the Corps of Engineers, where they will take in a preponderance of stakeholder impacts. They'll gather feedback from the stakeholders and make decisions on a weekly basis about how to manage the lake. Just so we know how complex this is page 38 of a 106-page document for LORS 08. This next slide shows kind of a history of different regulation schedules that have been employed to manage Lake Okeechobee. They have gotten increasingly complex, particularly as we better understand the factors and the impacts of Lake Okeechobee management. One of the benefits of using the NEPA planning process, is that it forces us to identify where we have knowledge gaps. And in each of these subsequent planning processes, we've identified knowledge gaps. Agencies and universities have attempted to fill those. And so as we approach the LOSOM process, some of the key differences that we have working in our favor is that we know things we didn't know when WSE was written or when LORS 08 was written. And also we've identified in this process new knowledge gaps that need to be addressed, and we've asked agencies and universities to help us fill in those gaps. This next slide, it's a little bit misleading. It's intended to show a timetable of where we're at in the current NEPA process for planning LOSOM. We have completed the scoping process, and we're into the formulation stage. It looks like we're halfway according to this illustration, but let me assure you we're not nearly halfway. The formulation phase, the alternative evaluation phase, and the last phase of the documentation and decision are very lengthy, thorough processes. So we have a long ways to go. In October of 2018, as a result of our understanding that there would be a new planning process, the county assembled a task force of internal and external experts to begin the process of advocating for the county in this process. And in January of 2019, the Corps announced the first public announcement that they would be accepting comments for scoping. And that's what kicked off our process. We expect in the near term, we have some milestones coming up where things are going to start to get a whole lot more tangible for us, and we're going to be able to start to see some of the outcomes of the stakeholder input and the efforts of the county. Key to that will be at the end of March. We expect the Corps to publish their scope for this project. They fielded scoping comments for most of last spring and summer. They reported back to us in the fall what the detail of that scoping comment assembly was, and what they'll be presenting at the end of March is what they believe the scope of the project needs to be, so we'll be keenly tuned into that. The next plan formulation team meeting will be focused on the modeling assumptions table. We expect that in late March or early April, and that's where we really start to see how some of the inputs are going to affect the evaluation of alternatives, and we can understand, we start to get a feel for where we can weigh in more detail. We also expect the initial array of alternatives at the end of May, and things are going to start to get a whole lot more tangible. So I'm going to hand it off to Jim Gordon, who is going to explain in a little bit more detail the county's involvement in this process.
Good morning. The 2019 scoping meetings that established our foundation for input into this process. The county's team assembled a very robust document that focused primarily on water quality and how identified the concerns and desired outcomes of the LOSOM. Much of the information that was contained in our scoping letter was also reflected in the University of Florida Water Institute research technical document where they independently reviewed LOSOM. One significant statement that they made that parroted what we included in our document was that water quality and water quantity should both be managed together in LOSOM planning and LOSOM operations. The rest of the engagement process throughout the plan development has been and will be concerned with defending and supporting our scoping letter at every opportunity. At this stage, the majority of our opportunity to input is still ahead of us. This is a 90-day look ahead that just reflects the meetings that we have that are scheduled to address LOSOM. There's a monthly project delivery team or PDT team meeting. Every other month, it's either a web-based meeting or a meeting in person. We have representation at all of those meetings, county staff as well as consultants. And it's important to note, even from the time that we made this slide, the dates and times of these meetings change. So the February meeting is now February 27th, not February 20th. So we have our staff constantly looking at that stuff to make sure we're well represented. As the LOSOM planning process progressed, we provided several other formal comments in addition to our participation in the PDT and sub-team meetings. Key formal responses were associated with development of performance measures, which will control the evaluation and ranking of alternatives that are put through the modeling exercises. Responsibility for Lake Okeechobee water management is not straightforward. It includes managing quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of water. Lake Okeechobee is at the heart of all of that. The state is responsible for regulating the quality of water in the lake and also moving the water in and out of it. Unless the water quality is right, the Corps' decisions on the timing and quantity of water moved has implications for aquatic life, human health, economics, endangered species, all the way out to the nearshore reef. This chart represents several related activities that the county has been working on with the same team that's working on the LOSOM process. The blue circle in the middle is LOSOM, which is the federal program that determines how much water gets moved where. The circles surrounding it are state programs that develop the regulations and standards for water quality. It is these state standards that are meant to result in good water quality and form the framework for the criteria used by the Corps to determine if water conveyance is meeting established performance measures. So for example, we've got the biosolids rulemaking legislation where Martin County advocated for tracking and regulation of Class AA biosolids as well as phosphorus standards. As you can see, these programs are interrelated with one another as well as LOSOM. With the Lake Okeechobee Basin Management Action Plan, Martin County has advocated for nitrogen standards in Lake Okeechobee because the nitrogen-rich water that is discharged through the C-44 impacts our estuary. In the St. Lucie Estuary BMAP, or Basin Management Action Plan, we have brought up our concerns with nitrogen that's coming from Lake Okeechobee into our estuary, compliance measuring protocol problems that they have in their model where the testing is not up to the standard that we think it needs to be. And the model that's used for the BMAP doesn't go all the way out to the nearshore reef. It only includes the estuary, and there are impacts offshore that we need to take into account. As far as coral reef advocacy, we developed a water quality monitoring report on nitrogen and phosphorus impacts to the nearshore reef. For the triennial surface water standards review, we advocated that the EPA adopt the EPA standard for microcystin and commented on turbidity standards with regard to coral reef impacts. We worked with Grant Gilmore on our endangered species petition, and he has identified that we have unique critical habitat for up to 9 fish species, and we're going to continue the work on that process. And this graphic just represents the interconnected nature of all of those programs. Our intent is to bring these programs and our comments to these programs into the LOSOM process, and all of our comments that we've given to date on the state programs and the federal programs reflect the information that I just went over. These are the sub-teams that are part of the LOSOM process. You got, they're shown on the screen. And we have Martin County representation on every single one of those sub-teams. They're focused on establishing performance metrics and tying them back to lake stage and flow. It's still fairly early in the sub-team process, and alternative evaluation performance measures are currently projected to be introduced to the project delivery team by the end of March of this year. These are open to the public, they're advertised, and if anyone wants to get involved with that, they certainly can. This is the project team that we have at the county. It's a very diverse group. We have county staff from various departments, and we also have engaged consultants that have specific subject matter experts that can address anything that we need commented on. And as we encounter additional needs, we've been bringing in more staff from the county as well as outside resources to make sure that we comment on what we need to. So all of the pertinent comments that I mentioned and John mentioned during this are on our website. This is the website address where they're at. Additional reports and resources are also there, such as the UF report from the Water Resource Institute. And the webpage is updated on a regular basis with that information that we have. So at this point, I'm going to invite Kathy and Ruth up in case you have any questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you kindly bring back up the flow chart of associated county inputs?
Yep.
Thank you. So one of the main questions that we're hearing from the citizens is how we're including health and safety, human health and safety as it relates to harmful algal blooms and algal toxins. You mentioned the triennial review we're pushing the DEP to adopt EPA microsystem levels. Is that the only mechanism for including a focused health and human safety element in LOSOM, or is it part of the I mean, is it a component of every single one of these?
So, yes and no. The interconnectivity for these things is they're all pretty symbiotic, right? And so, we would identify that the acute impacts for HABs is fairly well established. And so, the EPA's activity on that of establishing and adopting a standard for that, I think it really fuels our argument to make that a state standard, and I think it helps us with achieving our stakeholder goals. There are other health impacts that are probably more chronic in nature that we've yet to have a great establishment of. There's correlation, there's evidence, there's obviously a need for more research. And we're pleased to see that agencies and universities are picking up the mantle to try and fill in those information gaps. I think that'll help us in the future to make arguments for more health and human safety type factors as it relates to water quality. But at this point, I think the main factor is those acute HAB risks and how they relate to water discharges from Lake Okeechobee.
So with the acute risks, where are they warehoused on this? Are they part of that triennial review?
So probably the most significant component of that is in our scoping comment. So all of these really are kind of supporting that scoping comment, as they also support other efforts as they relate to rulemaking with the state or legislation related to water quality. But the main thrust of our argument is in the scoping comment, and that's where we address the human health aspects and the known human health and the knowledge gaps that need to be addressed.
So you would say that it's not perhaps appropriate, or there's not a real pipeline for staff to present at these meetings as part of this input process, the emerging research that's being published on, even though you say it might be correlative, thus far it hasn't been proven to be.
So we've been very proactive about approaching it. Whether or not it's appropriate, I can't answer that, but we do it. And the Corps is very receptive to concerns, whether or not they're proven concerns or not. They have fielded those. We put those in our scoping comments, and we do bring them up in public comment that this needs to be addressed. We think there's an issue here,
right,
or we know this issue, but this one may need some more testing, but it should be considered.
Yes, sir.
I think there's just one other thing, is that one of the key aspects is that the Corps of Engineers has acknowledged that microcystin blue-green algae is a pollutant and that they are transferring that pollutant into our water. And that was a huge change from prior policy that they've had. So with that brings that into this planning process as an integral part of everything that happens in LOSOM, because this is now something that the Corps is focusing on. So, everything that John said is absolutely right, but it's being looked at in a whole different view by the Corps of Engineers now.
To build on that, of the 5 sub-teams, one of them is water quality and HAB, so it certainly is getting its due process.
Merritt Matheson, City of Stuart. I'm very thankful for the county for this presentation. I cannot underestimate at all the importance of LOSOM right now and how it's going to dictate the future for the St. Lucie Estuary and all of South Florida. LORS 08 didn't work out too well for us. Discharges actually increased. Some of the stats I've been learning over the past month or so, as I'm sure any of you have been paying attention to the paper, have been a hot topic, at least for the city of Stuart. When the lake has been at 12 feet or higher on June 1st, during LORS 08, what we're in now, 100% of the time, the St. Lucie has received discharges over 25 billion gallons, enough to put the city of Stuart 13 feet underwater. So actually, the discharges got worse under LORS 08. So I'm very thankful for all the county is doing. I had a few questions, and talking about the lake height, as everyone probably knows, the city of Stuart, we unanimously expressed our concern of the Corps' about face and focus on water supply this dry season. 2019 was one of the best years we've ever had in recent history as far as damaging discharges. And I wonder if we'd be in actually a lot better position right now if the Corps didn't focus so much on water supply during the month of December and January, and actually had flows similar to what they are right now, going south and west. And I know no one in this room can tell the Corps what to do, but that's kind of what we're all trying to encourage. So my first question was if the county responded to Colonel Kelly's announcement of the somewhat of the about face of the dry season management plan that he announced over the holiday break. It's within their power to operate the lake the way they did in 2018 as well as the way they did in 2019. And I know we did receive discharges in February of 2019. And the city of Stuart's not encouraging discharge at all. We've been very vocal that our goal is 0 discharges. But our goal has been for them to manage the lake more in a way that they did in 2019 with full minimum flows west and flows south in full capacity. So I guess that would be my first question. Did the county respond in writing to the Corps' announced management plan and how it was different from 2019? And keeping in mind that the city of Stuart is well aware that their management was under the guise of increasing SAVs in the lake, which they brought up to about 28,000 acre feet, but the district's goal is 40,000 acre feet. So they changed their management plan without reaching the goal of SAVs, and their management plan in 2019, we were directly beneficial as far as discharges from the lake.
So I can address a few of those things, and some of them I can't. Appreciate your questions, Commissioner Matheson. So as it relates to the near-term strategy for the Corps of Engineers with the lake, so LOSOM, of course, as we understand, is a strategy for the next 10 years, and our task force has been assigned to pursue that objective. It doesn't mean that we're not engaged on the short term. It's not just a seasonal engagement, it's a weekly, sometimes daily engagement where we provide feedback as a routine mechanism to quantify the impacts and the needs of our stakeholders. For instance, every Tuesday afternoon, we're on a phone call where we assess all the conditions, the hydrologic conditions, tributaries, the outlook. I believe you were on that call yesterday, Commissioner.
Yes.
And then we'll provide input to the Corps in the interest of the impacts to our stakeholders. And so I don't think that the county has sent a formal position or statement to the Corps on the announcement of that strategy. However, every week we are encouraging them to meet environmental water supply needs, which would include discharges to the Caloosahatchee to maintain the salinity gradient that their tape grass and other seagrasses need, as well as much water as they can send to the south and still meet the consent decree. That's still a significant constraint to moving water south, is meeting the threshold of that geometric mean in the consent decree for Everglades National Park. The other thing I would say is that I forget what I was going to say. What else did you ask?
Well, I had another question, speaking of that call that I was on, and that was my first one in a few weeks. But Savannah Lacey, the Corps' host for the call, proposed 4 questions specific to the estuaries. And I guess they had been proposed prior to that call, but they seemed incredibly important because they have to do with kind of keeping track of performance. And a lot of historical performance is based on salinity. And some of her questions involved some of the tape grass, oyster spawning, and what the best conditions are, how our estuary is doing in terms of resiliency, and as well, another one was fish spawning. And what struck me was that's an incredibly broad question, but all of the questions definitely deserve a response from all stakeholders along the St. Lucie estuary. This is how they're going to base how the discharges are affecting us. So after that call, I reached out to Dr. Grant Gilmore. I can't think of anyone better who can describe fish spawning and what times and seasons they do spawn and how discharges impact our estuary. And that's information the Corps needs. His short-term response, though, was that year-round fish are spawning. And I've been in communication with him more on this issue, and I intend to forward some of his communications to Savannah Lacey. But stuff like that seems just incredibly important. Savannah was one of the Corps staff that I met at my meeting with the Corps. And so I guess going back, did the county respond to those questions on the call? And then to further continue, in the last PDT meeting, some of my concerns about this process basing off of performance measures again, the Corps had quite a bit more performance measures for the water conservation areas in Lake Okeechobee than they did for the East Coast. One of my concerns was that the St. Lucie and Caloosahatchee were linked together in how the Corps is going to manage their performance measures. As well, for performance measures on the Indian River Lagoon, their slides showed a question mark. And Mr. Mail, you were kind enough to forward me the county's request for those performance measures that be included. The concern is, though, that after that last PDT meeting, if there's still a question mark that the Corps is presenting on performance measures and they're still linking the St. Lucie and the Caloosahatchee together, which are 2 totally separate estuaries. One needs discharges from the lake, and a lot of times of the year are requesting minimum flows, whereas our goal is 0 discharges. So they shouldn't be linked together at all, and by no means should the Indian River Lagoon have a question mark on performance measures. It would seem to me that maybe after that last PDT meeting, a response would be deserved of why they're still at that point. So those were some of my comments and questions as where we are in this process. I guess my biggest concern is the best goal for our residents would be to succeed in the draft that LOSOM is coming out with, not to prepare for a rebuttal to the draft. And it seems like there's 2 different paths. And by all means, we should be prepared for a rebuttal from the draft. But if the draft doesn't seem like it's working out in our favor after each PDT meeting, shouldn't that dictate somewhat of an aggressive response after each meeting?
So I took some notes now, so I'll remember. But I'm going to reach back to one of your last questions that I remember.
I've been brushing up on this stuff a little bit, so.
I appreciate that. So you mentioned lake ecology, and our understanding from the Audubon's input on this issue is that last year the lake needed to get to 11 feet because there was no vegetation in the substrate, and I had the opportunity to go out and see it for myself. in these large littoral shelves that had virtually nothing left from Irma. And those lower lake levels, also had the opportunity to go back and see the new vegetation, and they really took hold, and there was this massive expansion, like you said, up to 28,000 acres last year. But now that vegetation is there, it's a few inches higher, and you don't have to get quite as low for the sunlight to reach those vegetations. In fact, if you went back to 11 feet, it might compromise some of that new growth, according to the Audubon, that managing it just a little bit higher, it probably is the best thing for the recovery of that submerged aquatic vegetation in Lake Okeechobee. So that's Lake Okeechobee's ecology, and that's my understanding of it. Our stakeholder interest, of course, has always been zero discharges, regardless of lake level. And as you mentioned, during LORS 08, which was put in place with the intention of keeping the risk to the Herbert Hoover Dike lower, forced the lake to be lower, and the way that they do that is to discharge it. So it naturally, or unnaturally rather, it created a scenario where the last 10 to 12 years have required more discharges to mitigate that risk. So we look forward to, at least in some capacity, when the Herbert Hoover Dike is complete, we've got attenuated flows from the Kissimmee headwaters restoration, we have more storage coming online in the C44, C43, that the flexibility of that storage provides for LOSOM. There's no way that we're not going to have some improvement. And as you said, we should be along parallel paths. And our capable litigator that's on the team, Ruth, has expressed that philosophy all along, that we need to both be preparing, doing what we can to be successful in the plan, but then also prepared to defend our interest after the plan comes out, regardless of how it comes out. So the county is definitely taking a parallel approach to those two things. And then I'll mention the questions on the periodic scientist call yesterday. They have been each week on those calls bringing up a suite of questions that address different stakeholder interests. Last week it was questions related to water supply, to gather more feedback and information on that. And you're right, those questions were, we can probably read too much into them or not read enough into them, but they do demand a response. And they talked about the salinity envelope. Well, one thing that we know is going on, and that's in the slide with all the lines on it, the connections between the different activities that the county has, is that there's a group called RECOVER, which is the Restoration, Coordination, and Verification team that is tasked with a scientific independent review of the northern estuaries, or the northern Everglade estuaries, to assess what those performance measures are. What's the envelope that's conducive to the holistic ecosystem for those estuaries. And I know that a lot of times in these meetings, they address the northern estuaries together, but I assure you that the information that is feeding into LOSOM for those performance measures is highly unique to each estuary. And they're using RECOVER as the establishment of those performance measures for us. So our scoping comment addressed exactly what you said, Commissioner, that we need to have a more robust and inclusive performance measure suite rather than just a salinity level at a particular zone. We recognize that the lake had a much more lengthy list of performance measures than the estuary, and that's one of our comments and one of our continual efforts is that the Corps would include a broader array of performance measures for the estuary. And then the last thing I was going to say, there was the final question on that call yesterday related to nutrient levels during 2018 when we had our last major harmful algal bloom in the estuary, and our current nutrient levels having not had discharges for an extended period of time, really since last February in any significant level. Those nutrient levels are, of course, drastically different. We looked those up, and we've provided that information to them. We like to do a lot of that on email rather than the phone call because it documents it, and we can reach back and say, yeah, we sent this. However, the last question was something along the lines of what implications does this have for our forecasting of harmful algal blooms? And that's something we definitely need to address because the question implies that there's a belief that nutrients in the estuary are seeding harmful algal blooms during the summer season. And it's our belief, and it's yet to be 100% proven, but we're making the effort to argue that the harmful algal bloom issue comes from the lake. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that in a saline environment, the harmful cyanobacteria is blooming or blooming with any significance on its own. And we don't have a period of record that demonstrates times when we haven't had substantial discharges where cyanobacteria is present. And there's also been some studies done that, it's not totally finalized yet, but, so this gets back to some of the knowledge gap. As the county follows through on this NEPA process, we've identified some knowledge gaps, and some of those we've got to ask universities to help us or the state to help us with. But some of them are low-hanging enough fruit that we can actually embark on some of that knowledge gap filling ourselves. And so we expect to be able to demonstrate that there's not persistent microcystin or microcystis in the estuary, that it all comes from freshwater discharges.
Ms. Clark.
Yes, hi. Good morning. I'm Eula Clark, Vice Mayor, City of Stuart. Can you go to like your first panel? It's like three pictures. Original, yeah, that's it. Original, current, and the restored flow. I just want everybody to look at it, especially the blue area. And of course that northern, where it had the pre-flow, the pre-storage flow. Is that what it is? I can't. Drainage flow. Okay. So I think Commissioner, I even put up my thing before he said it, but he said nobody can tell anybody what to do or whatever. But I'm just going to try to offer some advice. But before I do that, I just want to thank the Martin County for their work and their leadership and what's been going on. And everybody, the Corps of Engineers, everybody, because we live here together and we're all in this thing together. So it's so important. I want to thank the county and to thank our county administrator. So those three maps. So we're in current flow now. Everybody's talking about going south. I want us to talk about north. I don't pretend to know every single thing that's been going on with the Corps and all the communities to the north, whether it's Brevard County or Osceola County or Orange County, all these other areas. But this is Florida, we're all in this together, and whatever it is that those other communities need to know, especially to the north, when developments are being approved, when things are changing, when the agricultural interests are doing their work and whatever is happening, please remember, we're all in this together. So if you can see the map and you can see the changes and you can see how in the current flow, the second map pretty much dried out, drained out currently. A lot of things, that river of grass is changing, has been changing. This is what we're all working towards. Okay, that's the success, to try and get as much as we can get back to help restore that river of grass. Let's try to keep working on that. Whatever it is, our success is going to be when we can know that we're hopefully in a healthy environment and these algal blooms are less and less during the summer months. So I just appreciate everybody's work towards this, and my advice is let's keep working together.